Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this webinar. My name's Alex Deakin, and today we are talking about creating a resilient agriculture supply chain. Whose job is it to do what? This is a collaboration between ADAS and the Met Office as part of Countryside COP3. Now, this is the second of a trilogy. We've got 3 webinars on this week that we are hosting together that highlight the challenges and opportunities for UK agriculture to build resilience to the physical impacts of climate change. ADAS and the Met Office have been working together on research to help identify ways that farmers can adapt their practices to build resilience to climate change while strengthening the UK's food security. Now, as I said, this is part 2. We had a really great discussion on Monday. Monday's webinar was aimed at farmers and landowners. We heard from farmers directly about the challenges of the changing weather patterns that they're already seeing and having to make big calls in the UK. And we also heard from Guy Singh-Watson from Riverford talking about the challenges that he faces not far from where I am now in Devon, but also gave some great examples of how things are changing globally and working practices that have to change. And we'll hear a bit more about that in today's webinar as well. So as I said, today's one is about creating a resilient, I can't say that word today, put my teeth in, creating a resilient agriculture supply chain. And it's aimed at industry and agricultural supply chain. And we're asking the big question, whose job is it to do what? We'll get into it in just a moment, but allow me to introduce myself. My name's Alex Deakin. I work for the Met Office and have done for 25 years. My main role is to use the green screen you can just about see behind me and point at imaginary clouds and rain that aren't actually there. I've done that job for about 25 years, 16 or 17 of which I was at the BBC, presenting all the main flagship BBC weather broadcasts, the 1, 6 and 10 o'clock news, and I presented the Country File weather many, many times as well. I still do some of that. Hand waving, pointing at imaginary charts, still do a little bit of TV weather, but my main job here at the Met Office, which is where I am based now, Met Office HQ in Exeter, is for social media and YouTube and communicating the weather that way. But increasingly in the past 5 or 10 years, I've also become more of a climate communicator. Now, I am a meteorologist, not a climate scientist, but here at the Met Office headquarters, I do get to work with some of the best climate scientists around, a couple of whom we'll hear from today. And I get to make climate content for podcasts, for YouTube, and for our award-winning TikTok channel. So that's kind of me. That's my day job. But my job for the next hour is chair of this webinar. So I've got to keep everyone in check. And there's a couple of housekeeping points there on the screen. So yeah, we're going to have a couple of presentations before we get into the main panel discussion. So yes, if you can please keep your cameras off and your mics off. So although we don't want to see you, hear you for the next hour, we do want you to get involved. We really do want you to get involved and ask some questions. And I'll go through how you can do that in just a moment. One other thing I really do need to point out before we go any further, as part of being in this webinar, your name is visible to other participants. So if that's a problem, please disappear now and make yourself anonymous if you can. As I say, we'll have a panel discussion in a minute, but we do want you to be involved. And for that, we are using something called Slido. It's the magic of the internet where everyone can communicate with each other. It'll never catch on, but it's a really useful, really simple tool to use. A couple of ways that you can get involved, either on your phone, just scan that QR code, or on the website. Just type in that website, slido.com, and then enter the number COP3-2, because this is the second of our 3 webinars. And if you do that, you will enter the realm of Slido where you will be able to ask questions to the panel, but also you'll be able to help us out and answer this first question. So we're going to run three polls during the course of this webinar. The first one we'd like you to answer now, which is what organizers, so we can get an idea, a feel of who is on this webinar. If you could just type in the answer to that as soon as you can, that would be great. And then by the magic of the internet, it should appear in front of us and we should get a word cloud of where people are from. And it's working. Yes, this is excellent. So we've got Met Office, which is good. That's not me. That must be someone else in the Met Office. University of Leeds are joining us as well. ADAS here as well. RAC, NFU, RSK, CL. Sorry, I forgot that pronunciation wrong. I'm showing my naivety now, aren't I? It's probably very obvious who that is, but I don't know who that is. Frontier Agriculture have just gone really big. So lots of people have just joined from Frontier Agriculture. Environment Agency are here. Scotland's Rural College are here as well. As I said, Food Intelligence Limited are here, which is changing all the time. A few more from ADAS, a few more from the Met Office. That's really helpful. Thank you very much for being involved with that. That's really good. Keep those coming in. Retailer retired. Someone's just joined in. AIC are here as well. Pharmalytics are here. That's excellent. Thank you very much for filling that in. We'll go on to another poll, another word cloud now. Again, this is just really useful for background information for us so that our panelists kind of get a feel for who is on the webinar today. But what extreme weather events have impacted your business, organization, or supply chain in the past 2 years? Yeah, drought, floods, hailstones. We're hearing the other day on Monday from the farmers about how the heavy rain has really been causing problems. Storm Babette, that's interesting, and Curon as well. Flooding and drought is the main one coming through here. Fire on the farm, that's interesting. So heat, drought, flooding, they're the kind of main ones we're getting through. High temperatures. Storm Babette. What's interesting, is that wind or is that mostly rain damage? If it was Storm Babette, I'm guessing it was probably rain, but I may be wrong around that. Fire, flooding, high temperatures, heavy duty weather. That's a good one. I'll use that phrase in the future. I think when there's a storm coming, we're in for some heavy duty weather. I like that a lot. That's really helpful again. So we've got drought and floods and drought and flooding and drought and flooding and drought. So they're definitely the main themes that are coming through. That's really, really helpful. Thank you for being involved. As I say, please do keep being involved. If you haven't yet scanned this QR code, it's on the left there, or join online. And that is the mechanism by which you'll be able to ask the panelists questions as well once we get into that. So yeah, keep those coming in. That will remain open throughout. But we will move on now and get into a couple of presentations before today's discussion. As I mentioned, today's webinar is aimed at industry and agricultural supply chain. Food and drink retailers, processors, manufacturers, cold chain transport all have a great challenge ahead. The impacts of climate change on sourcing regions around the world will exacerbate supply chain challenges and security of supply of raw materials. How can resilience be improved, and whose job is it to do what, from supporting farmers to meeting consumer demand? First up, he's turned his camera on. Good man, Thomas Crocker is here. Thank you very much for being there, Tom. Thomas Crocker is a science manager of the Met Office's climate security team with over 11 years experience. Tom leads and conducts research on the interactions between weather, climate, and aspects of human security. Tom, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Alex. So as Alex has said, I lead a team that looks at elements of what we call climate security, and a big part of that is looking into food security. And over the last few months, a year or so, we've been starting to think a bit more about climate risks to food supply chains in general. So what do we mean by that? Is my slide forward going to work? What about that? There we go. Right, got it. So what do we mean by the food supply chain? So this image on the left, the diagram on the left, is from a paper written by a colleague of mine, Pete Falloon, who is going to be on the panel later. And this is essentially kind of mapping out kind of the different elements that we consider like in the food supply chain. So the webinar on Monday, we were mainly thinking about climate risks to the producing sort of side of the supply chain, and that's kind of, I think, traditionally where most people think of kind of climate risk when they're thinking about food supply. So it's the risk to production, and a couple of examples of that in recent history. So the tomatoes, I'm sure all of you remember earlier this year in the late winter, early spring, it was very difficult to get hold of tomatoes and certain vegetables, and that was largely due to adverse weather conditions in Spain and Northern Africa, Morocco. And then the second image, I think slightly less well known, but the heat wave last year in summer 2022, when we hit 40 degrees for the first time across parts of the UK, there were actually significant, much higher than normal instances of chickens as part of the poultry farming supply chain dying prematurely from heat stress, basically. Now, I'm not sure that there was a huge impact on consumers from that, but there was certainly an impact to suppliers and retailers and the producers themselves as well. So that's the kind of production side, but we've got a lot more here. There's a lot more elements in this supply chain, and the issue is that the climate can kind of impact on all of those as well. Plus, it's not just the supply of the kind of goods themselves that we need to think about. It's also other elements such as farm inputs, such as the supply of fertilizer. And another example is, I think, during COVID, at one point when you couldn't get hold of flour, the reason was actually due to a problem with the supply of the small bags that it was packed in rather than the flour itself. So even that producing section, it starts to become complex when you think about all the other elements that are involved in the production of the food that we actually see on our shelves at the end of the day. So the next one I'm going to talk a little bit about is transportation. This diagram is from a Chatham House report from a few years ago, looking at major choke points in global food trade. A lot of those are maritime in nature, so a large amount of goods are transported overseas. Some of those are inland transport networks as well, though either road or rail. And for example, a recent study looked into the soy supply chain from Brazil and found actually the biggest risk to that supply chain wasn't from a climate hazard on the growing of soy itself, but actually on the risk of landslides over the inland road network in Brazil. Another example of disruption is drought on inland waterways and other things. So this is an example of the Rhine from last year, where severe drought happening over the summer led to quite a heavy restriction on the volumes of shipping that could be transported through that region. And similarly, you may have seen on the news the reports about the Panama Canal having to slow down volumes of shipping going through there. Another big waterway, the Suez Canal, the ship that blocked that a few years ago, although I think the main cause was kind of human error, it was human error in relation to a weather-related impact, in that it was a kind of storm and particularly strong winds at the time that the captain kind of failed to navigate correctly. So we've got kind of climate impacts sort of impacting on transportation. Again, some of these slowdowns, I'm not sure they necessarily directly lead to sort of big shortages to consumers, but at the same time, they are likely to lead to higher costs and disruption to businesses inside the supply chain itself, which ultimately can lead to higher prices for consumers at the end of the day. And then the last example on this slide is in the storing and retailing side. And again, last year during the heat wave, we saw many instances of refrigeration systems in supermarkets and other places failing, which again leads to an issue around availability of supply and increased costs across the supply chain as well, kind of mitigating and catching up with that challenge. So that's kind of a flavour of the kind of what the problem looks like. This figure now is from the Climate Change Committee, and the Climate Change Committee conducts research on what the risks from climate change to the UK are. There's about 50 or 60 of them in total, but this figure demonstrates what they consider the kind of top 8 at the moment that should be the highest priority for kind of government and private sector adaptation in the next couple of years. And this one I've highlighted the screen, depending on how big your monitor is, you may or may not be able to read this, but essentially says risk to supply of food, goods and vital services due to climate-related collapse of supply chains and distribution networks. So it was partly a result of this report that kind of led to us at the Met Office kind of thinking, okay, we need to really start thinking about this a bit more, so that when we are approached by different stakeholders in the supply chain, we can start to think about what to do about these problems. And again, in terms of the sort of scale of the problem, it's this issue that it's not just a domestic issue. Around about 50% of our food is produced domestically, but around about another 50% is produced overseas. Majority from the European Union, but a lot of that from further afield as well. So that really adds to the complexity of the problem, in that while kind of domestic people in the UK can probably have some agency over what they do about problems in their own businesses or with the government, with the way that the UK policy is structured, it's a lot harder to influence things happening beyond our shores, and that really kind of increases the challenge of the problem. So how do we adapt to these risks, and kind of where do we think work needs to be done to kind of try and improve resilience here? So first of all, in order to understand future climate, we really need to understand the present day risk first. And in our work that we did earlier this year, we kind of identified that in many cases this isn't actually very well quantified. Some of the research, a lot of the research, there is research out there, but it tends to focus on individual components of the supply chains, either just the producing side or just the transportation side, for example, but putting it all together to get a holistic view of risk over the entire supply chain is actually a lot more difficult and doesn't tend to be done quite so much. There's limited literature looking at cascading and compounding risks, so quite often risks are looked at in isolation, when actually some of the biggest problems occur when these risks occur on top of each other, or two different risks, two different hazards occur at the same time. At the Met Office, we're quite good at understanding the kind of climate hazard, i.e. how big is a flood going to be, how hot the temperature is going to be, that sort of thing. But in order to understand the entire element of risk, you really need to understand the vulnerability and exposure. And in many cases, those aren't particularly well quantified in terms of knowing exactly what level of flood is big enough to cause a problem, for example. And lastly, there's also the possibility of unprecedented events, i.e. As we're seeing more and more, a heat wave last year in 2022, much bigger that we'd seen in the observational record. So understanding how unprecedented events could also interact in present day systems. Once you've got that, you can potentially start to understand the future risk. But as I said, we're not really even there with understanding present day risk yet. Then that leads into looking at what the frequency and extremity of events, how they'll change in the future. Dealing with the uncertainty also becomes a challenge, in that there is uncertainty in some of the projections, so we need to kind of deal with that as well. And then finally, that probably, once you understand all of that, you're in a position where you can start stress testing existing supply chains and seeing how they react to different future climate scenarios. So what does that all mean for the agri-food system? I'm just wrapping up now because I think I'm probably running short of time. But essentially, what does need to be done? As I said, we need to understand the risk. Then hopefully you can reduce exposure to that risk. So one example will be diversification, increasing sources of supply so that you're not so exposed if one of them does fail for whatever reason. Reducing vulnerability for adaptation. And then in some ways less effective, but by no means less important, is reducing the hazard through mitigation, which obviously is a global effort from everyone to reduce emissions and hopefully get to net zero, and that will lead to less climate change ultimately happening. But we're still going to be exposed to these present day risks that we're kind of currently experiencing as well. And then the real big question, which I think is what we're going to come on to later in this webinar, is actually who should be responsible for this and how does it get done? So researchers such as ourselves at the Met Office in academia can be a big part of that. But at the same time, I think there's definitely a role for the government and policy. So DEFRA and the Department for Business and Trade probably have a role to play here as well. And then obviously the private sector as well needs to take action to sort of increase their diversification, increase their adaptation resilience, and reduce hazard. But again, understanding the levels of responsibility of who does what is, I think, a question that's beyond my pay grade, as it were, and probably leads us quite nicely on into the next presentation. And that's it from me. Thanks. Back to you, Alex.
Thanks very much, Tom. Yes, excellent leading into the next presentation. That was really interesting. Thank you very much. And without further ado, we will move on to our second speaker. who is Emma Piercy, and she's also going to stay around for the panel discussion as well later on. So if anything crops up during this presentation, you think you've got a question for Emma, then you can pop that in the Slido deck as well, and we may come to that later on. But Emma is the head of climate change and energy policy at FDF. Emma is currently leading the development of FDF's sustainability strategy and developing the sector's roadmap to net zero to support food and drink manufacturers with the decarbonisation challenges ahead. Emma, thank you very much for turning your camera on and being there. I will hand the floor over to you.
Thanks, Alex. Next slide, please. So I will canter through these slides quite quickly. I think I've got about 15, 16, so I'll keep it short. Basically, I shall cover what we see here on the agenda, bit of baselining, what FDF is doing around environmental ambitions. So I'm taking, when I talk about sustainability here, I am taking it through the lens of the environment, acknowledging, of course, we have the other lenses too. What we're doing on the sustainability strategy and some other activities that we're engaged with. Next slide, please. So the first point is this graphic is taken from our Net Zero Handbook published at COP26. And for me, well, this is about the footprint, carbon footprint of the food consumed in the UK. And food itself constitutes roughly, globally speaking, about, I think it's 25% around that of global greenhouse gas emissions. In the UK, it's approximately about 20. What's really interesting, of course, is that we see that 2/3 of that footprint is from ingredients. Now, what I then sort of come to say is that, to me, this then demonstrates how important that the food system is, both in the context of the causes and consequences of climate change, and therefore, you know, that driver for action. Next slide, please. Again, a couple of stats that have already been sort of referred to. The majority of fruit and veg, you know, comes from southern Spain, and southern Spain is actually one of the top 10 most at-risk areas in terms of water risk. You know, this is what the graphic here sort of illustrates, and you know, what this means for potential future sourcing in the context of climate change, and you know what that might mean for those international supply chains. Next slide, please. The other sort of major aspect which we're developing on it, and again has just been alluded to, in terms of the climate change adaptation point of view, this very much links in with nature restoration and biodiversity loss. Whilst these have been happening in any case over, well, actually, to be fair, over the last centuries, but particularly, let's say, since, well, measurements sort of started, let's say, 50, 60 years ago, is that, oh, sorry, I've lost my train of thought there. Yes. So in terms of nature restoration and biodiversity loss, these are now being accelerated through climate change. And given the dependency of food systems on the environment and the ecosystem services that nature provides, that is the major driver then for nature restoration. Now, the challenge, again alluded to in the last slide, was around, well, who's responsible? And I think what's really interesting here is that when we look at this graphic on the right-hand side of the screen, you know, we see that in a sense, the owners of the asset, you know, at the top of the graphic, that is not, you know, the value change where the money is further down. So you've got a separation between the asset owners and where the sort of most value is in the supply chain. So that in itself, when we're looking at the financing and how to invest in nature restoration, this is why we need to get other stakeholders in the supply chain to engage in this. Next slide, please. Again, this is just another graphic which illustrates that point. Next slide, please. So, you know, we've seen a few drivers here, and you know, and why we have to act. But of course, the question is how. Next slide, please. So we have a FDF, that is, we currently have an ambition, environmental ambition, called Ambition 2025, and it covers these areas you see on the screen. But of course, we're now coming to the end of 2023, and this ambition, its time is going to be up very soon, and we need to start thinking Of course, we already are around 2030. Next slide, please. So 2 quick questions I have, in a sense, for this piece of work we're now working on, is how do we deliver for our manufacturing members, both large and small, and on those different time frames, the short, medium, and longer term, and what does a future 2030 scheme look like to replace Ambition 2025? And I realised I didn't give an introductory slide on FDF, so just to confirm for those that perhaps don't know, FDF represent the food and drink manufacturers, that we sit in the middle of that supply chain. Next slide, please. So in terms of what work we've done so far on the strategy, we've probably been working on this for over a year now, but part A has been mainly the research phase, both with members and non-members, and wider stakeholders, and it's really to look at the priority areas, and also, look at all of our, let's say, sister organisations, who is doing what, to try and work out where the gaps are and how we can work together. Part B was analysis of that, and then really sort of honing down onto some key areas, which we'll come to shortly. We're now on part C, which is developing sort of roadmaps for each of the key pillars. And then next year, we will be launching, I reckon it's probably going to be around summertime, but we'll see. Next slide, please. So we have 5 key pillars: net zero, nature restoration, sustainable commodities, food waste and packaging. These titles may get tweaked, but yes, I mean, we've covered some of those points already, particularly I think around net zero, alternative carbon emissions, and the impact around of climate change on supply chains and nature restoration. So those are the key areas for today. And of course, with food waste, a third of food producers wasted, and that of course has therefore major environmental impact. So all of these areas are really sort of dovetailing and linked with each other. Next slide, please. A couple of things we've done. So I think I mentioned this handbook that we published at COP26, and this handbook is basically a whole set of actions and ideas on how manufacturers can directly reduce the emissions and footprint of their own operations, but also the influence they can bring to bear at each point of the supply chain. Next slide, please. And that covers these areas. It's available free online to download, so I won't get into these now. Next slide, please. And I've touched on the necessity for collaboration, so working a lot with RAP. There is also a food and drink sector council bringing together the main stakeholders across the supply chain. We have a developing net zero work stream, and also this year we had a cross-industrial sector council launch called the Net Zero Council, which is again to help identify some of the shared challenges and solutions that will be important across sectors. So that's another good driver. And next slide, please. And I think in terms of policy, again, that was we heard that in the last presentation, that the role of policy to help aid some of this. And the Financing UK Nature Recovery Initiative, they published a big report last year. So again, look it up. It's very extensive. And this is just a graphic taken from that, which sort of illustrates the kind of work that will be needed to really encourage that step change in the levels of investment needed for nature restoration. So to help to help increase the investment levels that are essential, given the government's target of halting biodiversity decline by the end of this decade. Next slide, please. So conclusion summary. Yeah, we've covered it. We need a holistic approach, that involves all stakeholders across the supply chain. FDF are doing their bit in terms of we're creating our strategy, and we'll be, looking very much then at the steps of how we help our members to deliver that. And so that is very much part of this roadmap delivery programme. And we can't do that without our industry colleagues. And I very much see that all of what we've talked about today will really continue to increase in momentum as time progresses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. That was excellent. Really, really insightful, really interesting. We've already got one question in for you in particular in our audience Q&A. Do please keep them coming in, by the way, because Emma is sticking around for the panel, which is happening in just a moment. So yeah, you can go on, use that slider link to ask any questions that you want. We've got a couple in already, as I mentioned. But yeah, if you've got any questions about anything that you've already heard, then do get them in. But before all that, we do have one more poll. We're making you work today. So if you could get on and answer that as well, that would be great. Has your organization considered climate risk in business planning? So if you can get on there and answer that one, and then I promise as soon as this poll is done, we will get onto the panel discussion. People are filling it in already, which is brilliant. Thank you very much. So yes, we've undertaken a recent climate change risk assessment, currently at 71%. Not that I'm aware of. 10, 11%. Yes, we reported it to TCFD requirements. People planning on, that number's rising now up to 15%. So no one's replying. We've done one in the past, but it needs updating. So everyone's on it or not on it at all. They're either on it or not on it at all. So that's interesting. Just let a few more seconds for people to fill that in. But the overriding top answer is yes, we've undertaken a recent climate change risk assessment, which is good to hear. So more than half, in fact, almost 2/3 of people responding to that. How many have we had? 14 responses. So yeah, if you can get onto Slido and fill that in, that would be good. Or we are now up to 2/3. We've had another yes. So that's good. Good numbers. Thank you for filling that in. As I said, please use that link to Slido if you've got it open as well to ask questions to the panel, which is where we're going now. So let's get into the panel discussion. We've already met Emma, so that's brilliant. Don't need to introduce her again. But we do have three other fabulous panelists. So if you could all turn your cameras on or back on in Emma's case, that would be great. But we have Varian Bliss, who is from Food Intelligence. Varian is a non-executive and board-level director with 30 years experience providing agricultural, horticultural, agri-tech, sustainability and supply chain specialist consultancy services, focused mostly on technical and commercial improvement. So welcome along to you, Varian. We also have from this very building, Dr. Pete Falloon, who's joined us from the Met Office. Pete leads the Met Office's climate service for DEFRA on food, farming and natural environment, providing scientific advice to DEFRA to support climate resilience and adaptation in the agri-food system. Pete's got over 25 years of experience in modelling environmental systems. And Charles has also joined us. Charles Fuchs from ADAS. Charles is a director within the climate and sustainability business at ADAS with over 10 years experience. He is a chartered geographer supporting clients with climate change risk assessments, adaptation strategies, TCFD reporting, and building business resilience to extreme weather events. So that is our panel. As I said, please do get involved and ask some questions as we go along. We've got just under half an hour, so there's plenty of time for questions. But first of all, let's bring Varian in because we haven't heard from her yet. So Varian, just to get kind of a broad overview, maybe from your point of view, what do you think are the biggest challenges in building climate resilience and adaptation in the food chain? Everyone else can think about what they think maybe and chip in as well. But we'll come to you first, Varian. Welcome along.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Gosh, that's such a massive question, Alex. Thank you. So I'm going to go with some bullet points that we can maybe get some questions on as we go through. So data and information exchange, challenging areas in there, incomplete information on suppliers' vulnerability to climate impacts, make it difficult to prioritise and implement resilience measures. Within that heading there, I would also include education. I think there's challenging education, getting it down actually to grower level, and some of the terminology can be quite scary. So we sort of could do with some some expertise that can get down onto farm at grower level, maybe something a little bit more mandatory. I think we've got the education of consumers and what it means to be net zero for a consumer, but also in a supply chain. I think at the high end, the PMO businesses supplying into retail and into big brands, they will have the technical resource in there to be able to address these issues. But as one goes further down through the very complex supply chains, that understanding will become confusion, frankly. So we do need some really simple actions that people can take that don't scare them. They hear net zero and they just run screaming. We've got the general complexity in supply chain. My particular area of expertise is global fresh produce supply into retail, which I've been part of for the last 30 years. And we've got multiple tiers of suppliers, increasing the difficulty of mapping and assessing the climate risks across the entire supply chain, which makes planning challenging. We've got interconnected risks, so understanding the cascading effects of climate-related disruption, that requires a comprehensive and integrated risk management approach. I think, again, we perhaps need to reduce again the fear around the words of risk assessment. There will be people again lower down in the food supply chain who just think that that's just terrifying and don't understand that it is actually just looking a bit further forwards and a little bit wider. So there's a lot we can do in terms of terminology, talking about interconnected risk. We've got things that, so we've got weather effects, transport, which was touched on, but it also affects sort of product quality and pest and disease. So there's all those things that are really, really relevant. So it's not just about the vertical supply chain, it's about the effects of actually getting that product onto shelf. And a lot of the issues last January were down to, as you said, light levels, extreme weather in Spain and Morocco, but actually also the disease pressures out there that have come through these new weather patterns. We've got the financial constraints, which won't be a surprise to anybody. Implementing climate resilient measures require significant investment. Some organisations, especially smaller companies, lack the resource to make these investments. I'll just throw regulatory and policy uncertainty in there and move on, because obviously that's just an ever-changing feast, and actually, climate is a big part of government policy, but actually the support of government policy feeding into actual food production is at best a little bit sketchy, and the support measures in there aren't necessarily where we need them to be. We've got a collaborative and communication piece in there through the whole supply chain, but I think that goes right back down to customer level as well. It doesn't just sit in the top echelons. It's about again, changing this language and taking the fear factor out of the people, because it builds barriers. I mean, you've got communication challenges, and lack of trust can impede collaboration. We've got technical challenges, so adopting and implementing new tech for climate resilience. Almost, where do you go to start? And what does that look like? We know about advanced monitoring and warning systems, but there's technical challenges and they require substantial expertise and investment. And at what stage do operating businesses get involved with this tech? Because it's quite easy to get involved, at sort of at level one, but these iterations move on quite quickly, and businesses' ability to invest in these things move on is challenging. I guess we've got capacity building. Well, you did ask, Alex, so I've got a list for you. Capacity building and knowledge exchange, and behaviour and cultural factors. A lot of food production businesses have got their noses to the grindstone. It's about today, and that lean process of your lorry coming in today, assessing it, getting it checked, getting it packed and getting it out the door. So we're talking about having to bring more resource into businesses to do these expert positions, where actually there isn't the finance available often to make those employments. So yeah, they would be my top line.
That was brilliant.
Top 9 generic
very.
challenges.
No, you're quite right. I did ask, and that was an excellent summary. What a few things that came up quite regularly then is communication, which obviously is a main field for me. Then particularly interesting for me. You also mentioned data and information in that exchange, and that actually came up on Monday's discussion as well as being a big part. I'm going to come to you, Pete, because I saw you nodding. I also see, one of the best communication tools that we've got is right behind your head in terms of communicating climate change with the climate stripes, and actually making things simple for people to understand. And Varian mentioning there quite a few times, the language doesn't help. And in my job in the past 25 years, actually, we've simplified weather terminology quite a bit, but maybe we need to start thinking about that in terms of climate communication as well. But I'll come to you now to respond to Varian.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much, Alex. Lots to agree with it in what Varian said. Probably sort of 5 quick things, and I'll skip over them a bit where it's just really an agreement. I mean, I was privileged to be at the UK's Global Food Security Summit in London on Monday, and there were lots of good things said there around the importance of weather and climate shocks on the food system, and the need to think about innovation, technology, artificial intelligence, things like that in terms of solutions. One of the things I think really came across too was there's to be a joint international declaration taken to COP28 around food systems, noting both the need for adaptation and net zero goals, which I think is really welcome, and really also critically fantastic news that it's also supporting a food systems approach, which I think will be really challenging, but I think it's very welcome news. I mean, on that point, really, bringing through the technology and so on, and artificial intelligence decision making, supporting that, I think actually because of what Varian said, really, the complex nature and the varied nature of food chains, the many parts, but also the fact there are lots of different forms and shapes of them, lots of actors and owners. Data and availability really, is a key issue. Lots of people hold the data that we might want to use to understand the impacts of changing weather and climate shocks. And so there is a challenge in bringing that together and helping use it to, and the fact that there's probably lots of data as well, so access to it is an issue too. DEFRA's Food Data Transparency Partnership, I hope, will make inroads into that, albeit that it's focusing more on labelling and net zero in the first instance to make quick inroads. I think a second challenge is actually that much of the sector, and to a degree this is true of other sectors in the UK, is really thinking primarily about net zero and reducing emissions rather than the threats brought by the changing climate. And often the thinking around that is triggered by events and severe impacts, and really to have a more strategic view at understanding, just as Tom set out, what are our risks, what are our vulnerabilities, what do we do about them in a more organised way, I think would be really helpful. And maybe, linking to what Varian said as well, thinking about climate solutions maybe rather than separating out the two and breaking down the terminology, so that actually it becomes about the actions, the changes that are made and the benefits they bring in terms of lots of simple things, rather than someone saying, well, I thought I was doing this particular thing for net zero. Oh no, we're doing it for adaptation. An example might be, increased need for cold chain transport and storage of food in high summer temperatures, but that brings problems in terms of increased emissions potentially, unless it's fueled with green energy and so on. So, there's lots of room for bringing together the thinking in that space. In terms of what we know and what we don't know, I mean, we know quite a lot about production systems and how they'll be affected by climate change. We know a moderate amount about how that might sort of feed through into nutrition and the consumer end. We really know a lot less, and this comes back to the data, about what we call the missing middle, everything that happens in between there, how it impacts transport, processing, distribution, and the feed through to wholesaling and supermarkets and so on, what that really means across the chain in a joined up way. I think food safety is also a bit of an unexplored area. We've also got some initiatives going on with the UK's Food Safety Research Network, led at the Quadram Institute, but there are some challenges there in a changing climate. And really, finally, just want to very much, wholeheartedly agree with what Varian said about the people side. To me, you know, great having all this information technology knowledge if we can bring it together, but what we really need is to help build behavioral changes in practice, in decision making, in thinking, in mindsets, and education, communication. But you know, the solutions here really need to be co-developed with those right across the food chain. And I'll end there. Thank you, Alex.
That's really good. Thank you very much, Pete. Yeah, again, that communication coming through, and again, also data being mentioned there. Maybe I'll bring you in here, Charles, about data. I mean, it's something that you obviously have to deal with a lot. And do you find that an issue in getting hold of the data and giving it to your clients and in what you do?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what we do, we have to use the data we have available. I think often if you kind of wait for perfect data, that may never come or could be a long way down the line. So you've really got to use what's in front of you at the time and make the kind of assumptions as appropriate. The only way really to sort of plan ahead is to, kind of utilize the data that's available, to apply it to possible scenarios that could happen, and then sort of plan off the back of that. And it's interesting what Varian said about sort of the complexity of supply chains, because quite often there'll be parts of the supply chain that only really deal with kind of one step above them and one step below them. So they have quite a sort of narrow focus in their sort of understanding and awareness of the challenges across the supply chain. And I think as we move forward, we're almost going to have to take the sort of net zero carbon emissions approach, as in you have your kind of scope 1, 2 emissions where you're very focused on yourself, and then people are now starting to understand those scope 3 emissions right through the supply chain from kind of farm to fork. I think we almost need to take that sort of approach with adaptation as well. You need to understand what's happening at the very bottom of the chain as well as the top. And getting more data through that process, I think, will help all parts of the supply chain sort of build resilience.
Do you think that would help with consumers as well? I guess if they knew, all the way back to the origins about who's involved and what their responsibilities are and how much greenhouse gases they're emitting, would that change? Would that drive a bigger change as well?
Yeah, I think it will definitely have an impact. I mean, I think there's a movement towards people wanting sort of local domestic food where possible. And I mean, there's only, this week I was at home and my wife picked up an apple from Morrison's. It was in an awful state. It was kind of, okay, we're a bit out of season. And then she looked at the packaging and said, why are we buying apples from South Africa? And it's sort of, don't really want to be doing that. We want to be buying local things to us without those sort of big mileage. And it'd be interesting to hear from sort of Emma on that point as to how some of their members feel about that.
And sorry, go on, Emma, please.
I think there's a few things that I'd like to come to. And I think on this last point, I think we need to be quite careful when we consider or look at transport and food miles, because actually the amount of emissions that are associated with transport is very small compared to when you look at the different elements of the carbon footprint of food consumed in the UK. And local, it doesn't all, depending on the food stuff concerned, local doesn't necessarily always mean better. So there's a few things we need to take into account with that. The other point I think around driving consumer choices, I think, and behavioural change, labelling will have a role, but it's not a silver bullet. I think the greater impact from the work that's being done under the Food Data Transparency Partnership will be around helping bodies work out their footprints and looking at ways on how to reduce that. And I think more broadly in terms of data, so hooking together sort of the finance piece and investment, is that we need a massive step change in investment to meet these government targets that I mentioned. The Finance UK Nature Recovery Report said there's about I think it's 44 billion gap over the next 10 years, whereas government targets are something like 500 million private investment by 2027, 1 billion per year by 2030. This is not enough. So our current practices and our current challenges with data need to be overcome as I think they are a significant enabler to more investment. So particularly around choosing, well, what type of project are you going to invest in? What's going to have the biggest outcomes? How are you going to measure those outcomes? You know, how do you rate the success? And I think one of the challenges that's being seen at the moment, and this is more broadly, it encompasses nature restoration, but also other types of things, is concerns that consumers, investors have around greenhushing, I think is the new term I've heard. So there's a lot of enablers that we need to work on with data to help facilitate both the financing and therefore the investment of this work.
Good point you made there about, and I think that's really interesting. I've just started reading Ravenous actually, which talks about what you mentioned there. They're not all, because I think that message has got across. People want to buy local, but that's not necessarily the most environmentally friendly way to go. And there is an education piece there around how food is transported across the world, and that message needs to get out. Pete, you've got your hand up. I'll come to you.
Yeah, it was a quick one actually, to, you know, in terms of just, I think it illustrates the complexity of some of these issues too, in that we held a workshop back in January, particularly looking at the impacts of weather, climate shocks right across the food chain, and trying to understand how we respond to some of that. And some of the discussion was looking at the trade-offs and consequences between the various actions or changes you might see in the system. Local food systems is really interesting. Obviously, lots of benefits, but you know, the transport issue aside, a challenge is, you know, that if local areas get consistently hit, and particularly if you've got quite short supply chains, if you've got consistently hit by weather shocks, whether it's a heat wave, a drought, or flooding or something, then actually, in it, you know, to a sense, you're made more vulnerable. So, you know, if an area is particularly exposed in that way, one of the things that the positive sides, if you like, of the globalised food chain to UK food security is it does bring us some stability, because to some degree you're balancing risks by having sourcing from different regions. But one of the things we don't really know is how those risks change into the future, again partly because of data and knowledge, and we are looking at tackling that. Actually, Met Office are advertising a PhD project trying to look at some of those issues with the universities of Exeter and Bristol, because it's a, you know, it's a bit of a knowledge gap area. But it's, you know, it is just one example of actually it's such a complex system that tinkering in one corner can have big ramifications the other side. I mean, I also wanted to pick up a little bit on, completely agree with Emma that, you know, labelling's not certainly not the only answer here, but there is a need to sell to the consumers the story of, you know, of why eating you know, maybe less, and in a broad sense, sustainability sense, better for, you know, better food might be a good thing, and it's around sort of being clear about those certifications or the accreditation, the benchmarking, and those broader benefits. But certainly lots of work to be done there too, I think.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Pete. We're talking a lot about the supply chain, obviously, here today. Varian, maybe I'll come to you. Is there ways of, are there quick wins or obvious ways to shorten the food chain? Is that and or lessen at least the impact on climate with the food chain?
Thanks for that, Alex. It's so massively complex. I can't do it justice on this call. I mean, you talk about consumer behaviours and not buying South African apples, but you went to buy apples, you know, in November, so you clearly have a need for it. That's not going to come from a UK crop. So, you know, we have a mentality of being able to buy what we want whenever we want. So, and the convenience of that, and I hear it, I see it all over the press, you know, should be buying local, but we don't have a capacity in the UK for a start to produce the amount of food that we need. We only can grow, from my area of expertise, sort of 30% of tomatoes in the UK. That's all we've got the capacity for production of. So, you know, you can get them between April and, let's say, November. And then there's a tiny spot of availability over the winter that's grown under light, but then you've got the impact of the amount of light that you are using and the electricity energy generation with which to do that. And another point I just wanted to pick up on is about the labelling of food, etc. We also have to think about if we're going to put another scheme or another logo, well, that's another set of plates. So then you've got your whole packaging cost. You end up with thousands of tons of redundant packaging, and supply chains are generally in fresh produce so complex. You can be running numerous origins at any one time, and some of them won't be as advanced as others. So if one is labelling one, what is one therefore saying about the other? So there's so many layers of finance and complexity in this. So Alex, yes, I can come up with an answer for you. It'll take me a couple of days, and and we can chat about it offline. But it is such an enormous discussion point.
Yeah,
So,
no, that's that. I just wanted to just to emphasize that how complicated it is. I think it came across on Tom's presentation and Emma, just how quickly everything just gets very, very complicated. And as Emma said, there is no silver bullet. And we said that on Monday's chat as well. Hopefully on our third one, someone will also say there's no silver bullet. And just that message that get home that it is all very, very complicated, and there is no simple answers. However, I did ask for questions, so I do want to go to some from the audience who have asked. So let's go and see what we've got in here. This one is specifically to Emma. What role could B Corp certification play in ensuring food chain resilience to climate change? I'm not sure what B Corp certification is. Can you explain what that is, Emma? And
well, to be honest, I'd actually kind of have to say no. I say no.
That's fine.
I'm aware of it. The other presenters may have more knowledge, but I do know that there's quite a focus around the carbon, obviously, and if I remember correctly, I think it's net zero by 2030. Now, it will have its role, and I know some of our members have signed up to it, but I think more broadly, I would comment that we need to look at a wide variety of environmental indicators in order to get the optimal solutions here. So for example, if we only looked at carbon reduction on farms, we would not be addressing sort of the full, let's say, climate adaptation piece. Now, regenerative agriculture, as an example, will actually help address multiple outcomes. So I think that that's what we need to keep in mind, and I'm sure that there will be sort of an evolution of approaches. But to help organisations with a focus on understanding where your carbon emissions are and having a plan to reduce them, B Corp and as well as others, have a big role to play.
Thank you for that. I'm just conscious of time. We're at 57, so I haven't got long, but one more quick question that maybe the whole panel can think about just really quickly, because important challenges, as this is from Anonymous, important challenges to production, logistics and packaging/waste. Which do the panel think is the most urgent? And are they the same in all supply chains? I'm guessing, again, this is just, it depends, and it's very complicated. Does anyone want to pick up on that?
Well, again, Alex, sorry, could you?
Sorry, yes, I was talking quickly, wasn't I? There's important challenges to production, logistics, and packaging/waste. Which do the panel think is needs the most urgent attention? So I guess the listing of which is the most important, if that's at all possible, and are they the same in all supply chains?
So I could give I know Rarian's got a hand up. I could give a very quick answer. And
yeah, please. Yeah.
Fruit, I would say food waste. A third of food produced is wasted. That's, if you can reduce that, you'll get immediate impacts, both on the cost of living and environmental impact. So that would be my number one.
Varian, did you have? Yeah.
I'd go production hand in hand with food waste, actually, because one leads to the other. And actually, if we get our production side of things right, the transport, packaging, etc., we can blend into that. But there are so many challenges around the actual production of food in the first instance that then leads on to food waste, etc. But I think if we could start with food production, that would be marvellous.
I think we do need to be careful with that, because certainly with RAP statistics, 70% of food waste happens in the home, 2/3 of which could have been eaten. Now, there can be a variety of drivers for that, in which the production process or like the manufacturers maybe can help with some messaging, or we've got some challenges around use by best before. But this is where actually, you know, we see it across the supply chain, both at farming level, manufacturing, but quite a lot at the home that we need to address on this.
But Emma, production has to happen in order for there to be food waste. Yes, there is a messaging and an education piece around don't buy so much, but fundamentally we have to produce it right and have enough to supply everybody in the first instance. And that's that's my angle on it, because that is where the significant challenges are coming from. So nobody should be wasting anything, but if we can't produce it in the first place, that wasting it's going to be a secondary issue.
Well, I think that it's an interesting point, because it's about demand drivers. Now, if consumers are demanding it and then it's not on the shelves, that's where there's a challenge. So I mean, there's a phrase that I heard once about supply chains being pulled rather than pushed. So there's some different dynamics here which clearly we need to work through, and all have an important role.
Excellent stuff. Good discussion, guys. Thank you very much for that. We are out of time, annoyingly. Where did that half hour go? I thought we had a bit more time today compared to Monday, but it seemed to disappear straight away. So thank you very much to our panel, to Emma, to Charles, to Varian, and to Pete. This webinar has been recorded. If you registered and you've been on it, then you will get an email afterwards, which will have a link to it, so you can go back and watch it if you have to dip out for whatever reason, or if you missed the start. And we'll also contain some details of how you can get in touch with the organisers if you've got any follow-up questions, or you want to contact any of the panelists direct. This is the second of 3 webinars. We have another one tomorrow. See if we can get the silver bullet mentioned again for the third one. We can hit all 3. That would be great. That's at 3 o'clock tomorrow. It's aimed at decision makers, and the title is Supporting a Resilient Agri-Food Sector. What are the big questions decision makers face? It says it's aimed at decision makers, but obviously everyone who is on this call is also very welcome to be part of that. But thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, Alex.